All righty. And so hello, everyone. Thank you for joining after lunch and the keynote speaker. And so my name is Micaela Orr, and I am an intern at Alabama Possible. I am moderating this session. And so thank you again for joining us. This breakout session is sense of belonging in diverse, equitable, and inclusive higher education environment. Is focused on the conference theme of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Our presenters are Michael L. Jones and Misty H. McFadden from Miles College. Their bios are published in the program. And so before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. We will have some time for a Q&A at the end of this session. And so if you have questions, feel free to put it in the chat. And then before we exit the session, I will be putting a survey that's really quick. And if you've been here all morning, you're already familiar. It's 2 questions. And so we just ask that you fill that out before the end of your session, the end of this session, excuse me. And then, of course, if you would not mind, just please make sure that you are muted while our presenters are presenting, just so that we can avoid any interference. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Misty and Michael.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Jones, and my colleague, Ms. McFadden, will be introducing you all today to our presentation, as the moderator indicated, on a sense of belonging in diverse, equitable, and inclusive higher education environment. So let's get started. So the first thing we want to do is, I believe it's already happening via the moderator, is that your microphones are muted, and you don't have to worry about the cameras in the conference environment. But if you have any questions, as indicated by the moderator, we will take those at the end of the presentation. I want you to get excited about what we have to share as it relates to sense of belonging in a diverse, equitable, and inclusive higher education environment. But I want your excitement to kind of be centered around, encapsulated around certain learning objectives that my colleague and myself will be touching on. There are 2 specific learning objectives that we'll talk about. And one is we're going to explain and differentiate what DEIB means at your respective institutions. And then we're going to design and assess DEIB's good practices aligned with mission and strategic goals for implementation and future sustainability at your institutions as well. So again, our bios are published in the programs, but my presenter, my colleague, Ms. McFadden, this is just brief information on her. She has more than 20 years of experience in higher education research and analysis, and she will be the one to come to you to discuss the second learning objective of this presentation as well. So she's worked in assessment, accreditation, data collection and analysis, and training in the higher ed environment. And like myself, we are both data equity fellows with SAC-COC and NWCCA. I'm sorry. And then myself, Michael Jones, over 15 years of higher ed experience. That would include different leadership roles in academics as well. And so we will be coming, the reason I'm sharing this with you is because we'll be coming from our own lived experience lens of understanding as it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So first, I want to share with you the DEIB journey begins with yourself. In this terminology is the combination of meanings, and we're going to get off into the devil of the details of the meanings. But first, you cannot really execute or understand diversity, equity, inclusion and belonging without first understanding who you are and how you navigate through your space from your own lens, which is generated from your own lived experience. So this is a quote that comes from the Equity Talk and Equity Walk book, which is a quote, which is a book that we're using as data equity fellows to kind of help us navigate through an equitable lens. And one of the quotes that came out of the book is that change must happen individually before it can happen collectively. People drive change, lead change, and sustain change. Lasting change happens when educators understand both the meaning of equity and that meaning is represented through personal values, beliefs, and actions. This is why this journey must start with you. And one of the a couple of the key terms in this particular quote is that educators, they need to understand the meaning of equity and how it represents through your own personal values, beliefs, and actions. So the learning objective 1 is we're going to explain and differentiate what DEIB means at your respective institutions, because it's interesting to kind of see how that works. So we're going to do a little word cloud, and I hope the technology cooperates with me. So if you would just go to poev.com, the information here on the screen, / Mikael Jones 188. And there should be a question there that says, is diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging? What is it? What is it? What do you think based upon your own knowledge? You don't have to come from an academician understanding, but just based upon your own knowledge, what do you think it is? So I am going to minimize this for a minute. Oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry. Minimize this. So we're gonna go here. You can see my screen. And let's see how many responses we got. It's activated now. So if you can go in and tell me, what is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? You can just text it. It should show up. I'll just give you a couple minutes to do that. And the poll has been put in the chat box. What is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? Welcome, perspective, okay. Heard, progress, all right. Place, all right. I see welcome twice, perspective twice. Okay, anybody else? Okay, so, table, seat, a seat at the table. Okay, great. Open-minded, great. And so those answers that you share are not wrong answers. They're all very relevant answers to each of the terms that we're going to cover today as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So let me go back to the presentation. So in theory, when we think of it from an academic standpoint, the understanding of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Diversity is recognizing and valuing our differences. So recognizing and valuing our differences. Oftentimes people equate diversity with color, but color has nothing to do. It's a difference, but it has really not a whole lot to do with diversity. Is mainly, again, recognizing and valuing our differences. Equity is creating fair, individualized support and resources. Oftentimes people equate equity with equality. That's two different terminologies. Equity is creating fair, individualized support and resources. And inclusion is making sure that everyone has a seat at the table, Seat at the table was one of the terms in the word cloud that I saw. So that's inclusion, making sure everyone has a seat at the table. And this is from our thought leaders on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Conway has shared a couple of these definitions based upon the lived experience of many in higher ed. Now, why is belonging so important? Belonging is the key to true success within organizations that want to prioritize DEI and B. Belonging needs DEI. They need belonging, the term belonging, the process belonging needs diversity, equity, inclusion in order to cultivate and thrive. So without belonging, according to Conway, diversity, equity, inclusion can be just lip service without any substance. So you can have DEI, but if you don't have that sense of belonging, then it kind of negates your recognizing the differences, your individualized support in an effort to be fair, and it negates you including everyone at the table if we don't have a cohesive sense of belonging. So what does DEIB mean at your institution? And when I talk about that, what does it mean at your institution? I want you to think about these terms in reference to the cultural perception of your respective colleges, campuses, or K through 12 environments. Think about what does that mean to your culture. What does that mean to the practices at your institution? What does it mean to your mission and your vision and your strategic goals at your institution? What does DEIB mean in the grand scheme of the culture of your workplace? Okay, so think about that. So here's another poll we're going to go to, and I want to know your thoughts. From the cultural and lived experience lenses of faculty, staff, students, and college and university stakeholders, what does diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging really mean? I mean, so when I'm talking about from the lived experience, I'm talking about from your own, the way you've navigated through life, just your own lens. So if you're a faculty person, if you're a staff person, if you're a student, or just a stakeholder at a particular higher ed institution, what do you think that means to your workplace? So we're going to exit out of this again and go to the poll. Yeah. You all get to see all my stuff. Go to the poll. Go to the poll. Okay. Here. I'm going to activate. Oh, no, that's the other poll. I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, it should be activated. So now I want to know from the cultural and lived experience lens of faculty, staff, students, and college and university stakeholders, what does DEIB really mean? Just know, I just want to know, just based upon your experience. You can just type it in. It should pop up on the screen once we get a response. It could mean a myriad of things, but from stock statements. Okay. All right. That's interesting. It has been mostly focused on race. That's true. That is so true. Something we have to include so we don't get sued. You're right. That is definitely true. Anyone else? Okay. All right. Okay. Someone is agreeing with that first statement. Okay. All right. So we'll stop it. We'll go back to the presentation. So this is interesting. So we see that from a cultural and lived experience as it relates to your higher ed institutions, that DEI and B is more of a bureaucratic process and not a meaningful process. We understand that is a buzzword now, but they're more than just buzzwords. So when we talk about an analysis of DEI B framework, it is important to the eradication of preconceived biases from institutional decision making. So it's important that we use these particular frameworks when we're trying to establish policies and procedures and practices, so it can be more meaningful and not bureaucratic. Meaningful in that we make sure we include the cultural and lived experiences of all who will be affected by policies, procedures, and practices that we put in place at our respective institutions, and also that it will be inclusive of all viewpoints of the people who will be participating in facilitating those policy, procedures, and practices at specific institutions. So let's talk about what are the recipes behind DEI and B. One of the driving forces behind, and I know this is another word that we probably heard over and over again, implicit bias. But implicit bias is a foundation or a context in developing one's viewpoint of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So how do we confront implicit bias? Well, first of all, we have to understand the term within itself. What does that mean in this construct? So it's awareness first. Implicit bias refers to the unconscious attitudes, reactions, stereotypes, and categories that affect behavior and understanding. In higher education, implicit bias often refers to unconscious racial or socioeconomic biases towards students, which can be as frequent as explicit bias. So when we're talking about implicit bias, this is something that's going on within you. Remember the quote that we begin the presentation with, that it starts with you. Equity, it starts with you. So implicitly, we may not know that we're doing things, we're acting out of certain ways, we're operating from a different perspective, and it may be bias, as opposed to explicit bias when you're talking about just kind of overtly being maybe prejudiced against someone. So let's look at examples of implicit bias as we talk about in higher ed. So implicit bias, or just in a educational organization. Implicit bias could look like an instructor may assume that certain students know to seek help when they are struggling, although students at higher risk for struggling academically are often less likely to seek help. That's implicit bias. Instructors may assume that students from certain backgrounds or social groups have differing intellectual abilities and or ambitions. Instructors may expect students who speak with certain accents to be poor writers. As an English teacher, I've experienced this. I didn't have, I guess it would be a level of implicit bias, because I felt that I had a lot of, at one time I was teaching at an institution, and my classroom, my basic composition classroom was primarily filled with foreign students. Students from Cuba, students from Kenya, and I had a few American students in the class. So with basic composition, you would think maybe because they come from a different culture, that they may have a hard time navigating through the English language, which is very difficult to learn if you speak to someone who had to transition from one language to the English language. Well, it panned out that the foreign students performed better with basic composition than the native English speakers. So that was an implicit bias I had early on in teaching in higher ed that was quickly dismantled, because you have to think about all of the lead work that it takes, first of all, to learn the language, the mechanics of the language, the grammar and linguistics of the language, if you are a foreigner as opposed to a native speaker. So these are things that you may not even be aware of, that are considered implicit biases that may affect the way in which you navigate through your classroom setting or workspace in higher ed or K through 12. So students with a substandard writing ability may be stereotyped as lacking intellectual ability. That is an implicit bias. That all students who, they may be critical thinkers, but they may have a difficult way of learning how to navigate that and put it on paper. Another examples of implicit bias, instructors might treat students with physical disabilities as if they may also have mental disabilities and thus require more attention. Now, as a parent of young children, oftentimes I can say that my children probably have implicit biases when I can't get up the stairs because I have a half a century old knee. So they'll start yelling at me if I move slow. Well, I'm not deaf, I'm just having a hard time moving. So in this case, it's a comical, satirical example, but it's real when we think about simply how we treat some people or some students with disabilities, and believe that they may be handicapped in other areas or have mental issues as well. Students who are affiliated with a particular identity group may be treated as experts on issues related to that group. It's an implicit bias if you're asking, if you have maybe 2 African-American students in a classroom full of predominantly white students, their take on what has happened with the George Floyd situation, or what is your take on this? Or, that singles them out. That doesn't make them feel like they belong oftentimes, especially if it's a high political profile topic. And then they probably really may not have a real substantive response to it for the culture. So, that is, you may not mean any harm as an instructor. You may just really want to genuinely hear from their lived experience as being Black in America. However, it could translate as something else like an implicit bias. Instructors may assume that students will best relate to the historical, contemporary, or fictional character who resembles them demographically. Students of certain groups may be expected to have certain participation styles, like they may be quiet or argumentative. There is a stereotype on Black women called ABW, angry Black woman. So if a Black woman raises her voice, the pitch and tone of her voice is elevated, she's then argumentative. So these are things that we don't necessarily wear a banner, but we do demonstrate in subtle ways implicit biases. So what are some of the recommendations that one could give in order to kind of alleviate or take inventory of some of those implicit biases that may hinder you fully addressing or fully operating in a diverse, equitable, inclusive, and belonging manner? So a self-assess implicit biases is the first thing. It's very important that we always kind of check ourselves, see exactly where we are. What's the litmus test for if we're doing well or if we're not doing well? So reflective teaching offers formal and informal strategies for considering one's own pedagogical habits. So instructors may take an online self-assessment, but I recommend that you take the Harvard University's implicit bias test. And that's through the Project Implicit 501c3, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Cultivate inclusivity, have an inclusive classroom environment, and include inclusive teaching practices, which can mediate potential bias attitudes and support developing sensitive and deepening self-awareness. Also solicit feedback from outside observers, like a teaching inventory or observation protocols. Some institutions have that. You have classroom observations. You might have a center for teaching and learning at some institutions where they visit the classrooms, observe the student-teacher interactions, and provide feedback. So solicit feedback to make sure an outside observer, because we can be very biased, and oftentimes we can be our worst critic. So make sure you include that to remediate any implicit biases you may be aware of in yourself. And lastly, you want to solicit feedback from students. I mean, students are great assessors. Feedback from students via midterm course evaluations or end of term evaluations or small group sessions to assess whether the unconscious biases manifest in their classroom. One thing about Generation Z, they're very vocal. They're very matter of fact. They don't sugarcoat anything. This is a generation who uses social media to kind of tell how they feel. They will get on social media and put everybody on blast before really they have that conversation with you. But if you create an inclusive classroom, an inclusive climate through inclusive teaching, then you can have those courageous conversations in your classroom about if there are some biases or unconsciouses they may be experiencing from you as an instructor. So this is Project Implicit from Harvard University. Project Implicit is a 501c3, a nonprofit organization, an international collaborative of researchers who are interested in implicit social cognition. So what they do, it was founded in 1998, and the mission of the implicit Project Implicit is to educate the public about bias and to provide a virtual laboratory for collecting data on the internet. So Project Implicit gives a plethora of information on research they've done on implicit biases, and Project Implicit also are the ones who instituted the implicit bias, the Harvard implicit bias test. And you can access it if you just Google Project Implicit or Harvard's implicit bias test. I would strongly encourage you to take that test. So when we talk about sense of belonging in a diverse, equitable, and inclusive higher education environment, one thing it begins, you got to begin with the budgeting from a DEIB perspective. The goal is not to insert limited DEIB initiatives where they can fit around established systems so we can say that we check the diversity box. I know in one of the word clouds, the last poll we did, somebody said we institute DEIB so that we won't get sued. But it needs to not be a bureaucratic process. It has to be meaningful. We don't want it to be a check box type process. So in order for it to be meaningful, we got to tie it to a budget. And so in order for it to be woven throughout the operations and the breadth of the institution, it must be tied to some budget. So let's look at how can we do that. Also use faculty as diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging champions. Faculty buy-in is important. I mean, you know, I've been in higher ed for some time. I was an associate dean, and I understand how important it is in order for faculty to really have some type of sense of ownership or connection or context as to why we are asking them to do things. I strongly believe that retention starts in the classroom, because if a student is not invested in the faculty person, they're not going to be invested primarily in what they're teaching. This is equally important for institutions, minority serving institutions as well, because we have a lot of first generation students. And so faculty being champions, having buy-in in the DEI and B process will help with classroom instruction with the intent of prioritizing it throughout their curriculum, their experience, their interactions, and how they translate that to students. And then finally, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the classroom. Now, a diversity of content and voices in the classroom materials provides a holistic view of your discipline. There is a term, another we would consider a buzzword term, but it's in line with DEIB, is decolonization of the curriculum. And so when we talk about decolonizing the curriculum, we're talking about several things. We're talking about like revamping the curriculum, how to engage with issues of power and hierarchy and equity and tracing ideas in the curriculum. You want to reimagine our syllabi. Our syllabi are very like cookie cutter. So you want to, how do we engage and motivate students and encourage them to participate actively in their own learning? And then with decolonizing the curriculum, you want to reimagining classroom dynamics, not about content, but how do you make every student feel a sense of belonging? You know, how do you orchestrate lively, dynamic discussions without fear or embarrassment or ridicule? You want to rethink your pedagogies. You know, should you challenge the idea that the instructor is the sole holder of knowledge? Should we challenge that idea? Because in teaching, you have to understand now, when we're talking about the information age, and especially again, we're talking about Generation Z, information is vast. They will fact check you right there in class. So, you know, we have to really kind of dismantle the belief system that the instructor is the sole holder of knowledge, because that is not the case anymore. Information is too vast. And then lastly, about decolonizing the curriculum, you want to bring in all students to mastery. So that means you want to equal education access is just not enough. It requires an instructor to recognize and reject practices and norms that lead to students to disengage and acknowledge that many traditional forms of assessment are biased and fail to accurately measure students' command of the material. So in decolonizing the curriculum, it's just certain areas you want to look at. And there is a article on decolonization of curriculum inside higher ed that I shared as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ms. McFadden, and she's going to talk to you about Learning Objective 2, design and assess DEIB's good practices aligned with mission and strategic goals for implementation and future sustainability. Misty?
Thank you, Michelle. At Mouse, we have what we call a shared governance process. And we do this through a group of people, team of people that have permanent members, revolving members, and invitees. And this committee, this team is called the Institutional Planning and Assessment Team. For short, we call it IPAT. For IPAT, we do a couple of things when we meet. We meet maybe at least 2 times a semester. But during this time, the IPAT members, they need to evaluate the college's commitment to the institutional quality and effectiveness. And we also need to review the institutional goals, the mission, and any outcomes to make sure that they are all consistent and they're guiding the school in the right direction. Any decisions or recommendations that are made within IPAT are based upon research and data. The main portion, everything around that we do at IPAD is centered around the mission of the institution. And it says, whereas IPAD is responsible, we've synchronized those strategic goals, the priority initiatives, the objectives, assessments, and all of this is centered around the budget. And these efforts are a very important part for the college's ongoing comprehensive and integrated research-based and data-based planning and evaluation process to make sure the college is addressing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging to all institutional stakeholders. And when we say all institutional stakeholders, we're not just talking about students, but we're looking at faculty and staff. So IPAD, we look at the mission statement every time we meet, but every 5 years, we look at it to make sure that it is meeting the needs of the institution, that everything, that it addresses what we feel like the college is at that moment. And you can go on forward to the process. In this process, the committee, we meet, and hopefully you can see this, we meet and we discuss if there are any changes that need to be made. The team only makes recommendations to the president. The president can either accept it or deny the changes. If the president, if she denies it, then it goes back to IPAD and we go back to the drawing board. If she accepts the recommendation, those recommendations are submitted to the Board of Trustees, and the Board of Trustees is the final approval of any IPAD recommendations. This process also goes with how we review the college's strategic goals and priority initiatives. So when we're looking at strategic goals, those are reviewed also every 5 years. We kind of keep those they're standing for 5 years, and we just kind of review those. How do we review those? We use what we call priority initiatives to guide us into if we're meeting those strategic goals. And the priority initiatives are also reviewed yearly. Those priority initiatives, we're really looking to see what did the college do within that year in order to meet the strategic goal. Okay, again, the 5-year cycle, it all starts with the recommendation from IPAD. We review everything that happened within that academic year. Then we make any type of recommendations. We might say that a priority initiative is deferred, or it might be completed. We might feel like we have done all we need to do with this priority initiative, and we need to just say it's operational. Those recommendations are made to the president, and then the president again submits those recommendations to the board. All of this really is centered around the budget. The budget can't not be put in place unless we have some goals. And then we can't disperse the money unless we know what we're dispersing money for. The process starts at the beginning of an academic year with the president and the cabinet members, and they sit down and decide how much funds are going to be going to each area. From there, units are provided a budget package, and they have until that goes out to everyone in October. The package, they use that package, and it is then submitted to the committee, the budget committee. I want to say in February, so that it can be reviewed with the Board of Trustees in the March meeting. That's the flow chart, and if you can go on past that one. With the IPAD, again, as I said, everything centers around the mission statement, and we want to make sure that it is synchronizing with the strategic goals, priority initiatives. and that everything is tied into the budget. We also want to look at using data and any type of research in order to make the recommendations to the president from the IPAC committee. And we definitely, these focus areas are then reviewed to ensure appropriate association with the college's mission and strategic goals. Okay, this is the process that we use. Again, everything centers around the mission statement. We start out by doing research or using data for the planning and institutional area of focus. It is, we evaluate the process and review any type of findings that they are. We also review the institutional mission goals and those outcomes. We always about continuous improvement based upon what could be used to what could be put in place to improve upon our review. We go back to the planning and strategic goals, the priority initiatives, and making sure everything aligns with the budget. It then goes back to the institutional planning and our office, the institutional research office. We then sit down and come up with a comprehensive assessment for the institution. So for campus integration and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, we're saying that there needs to be 3 things put in place. You need to make sure that the mission statement addresses diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Not only does the mission should address it, but does the strategic goals address these things. Finally, again, you want to make sure that you have things aligned and put in place, such as how does the college define diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And we feel like that in order for it to be embedded in the college, it needs to start with being included within the mission and the strategic goals of the institution. Just recently, there is an article out in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and it's about, the title is "The New Accountability, How Accreditors Are Measuring Colleges' Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Efforts." The reason I want to mention this is because almost every school in the state of Alabama is either definitely accredited by the Southern Association of Colleges of Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, SAC-COC, and we do not have a standard that addresses diversity, equity, inclusion, or belonging. But we do definitely have a standard where we do have to disaggregate our data. And also be aware that the GOP, the Alabama GOP, just recently did a resolution where they want to abolish DEI statements at state and at state institutions.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so that concludes our presentation. And if you have any questions or concerns or comments, you can contact myself, Mikhail Jones, or Miss McFadden, Misty McFadden. This is our contact information. And I believe our contact information may be in the